All right, this is a humongous topic, so let's see what we can cover. Why do we get these problems? Well, it's a confluence of the cultural practices you're using. It could be your fertility program, it could be drainage, the genetics of the crop, and then the environment has a big role to play. So with vegetables and fruits, why so many problems? Well, with vegetables, they're quick growing. With fruits, they have those long seasons, they're multiple years. We have a lot of fruiting crops, so the fruit development can be an issue. Quality factors, oftentimes we'll grow a nice crop, cut it open and it doesn't look good, or you eat it and it tastes crappy. So those are issues that we have to address. And then we're trying to go into multiple environments with multiple adaptations, which is hard for any variety to do, and therefore some varieties aren't going to be able to, we'll have some problems in certain situations. We have multiple ways of growing vegetables and fruits, and then, of course, there's less breeding efforts going on with many of our specialty crops. So I'm going to start off with one that we have a lot of problems with in fruits and vegetables, which is calcium disorders. This generally isn't a problem in field crops, but it is in fruits and vegetables. So some more common disorders are blossom end rot in tomatoes, peppers, sometimes in melons, leaf tip burn and edging in crops like lettuce and spinach. And then we'll get internal defects in fruits and storage organs, such as browning, spotting, cavities, watery areas, or we'll get distorted tips, shoots, and roots. And that's because calcium is a structural part of the structure of the plant. It's in the cell wall, it's in the cement that cements cells together, and it's in the cell membrane. So it's a critical component of the structural part of the plant. So if you don't get enough of it to those areas where you have new growth occurring, those areas will not develop properly. It's also important for root hair development, pollen tubes, and extremely important for development of those new cells in your meristems and your roots and shoots. So some examples of blossom end rots. You have watermelon, pepper, tomato. You can see a very common problem. And our tip burns in cabbage and spinach, lettuce, and our distorted growth. You can see it almost looks like virus, and that's in peppers, beans, strawberries. And then these internal defects in cavity spot in carrots, hollow heart, brown center in potatoes, or bitter pit and cork spot in apples. And calcium is one of those, it's a nutrient that needs to move up into the plant in the transpirational flow, and it needs to be exchanged off the wall of the xylem. So you need a constant flow of water, and you have to have a constant supply of calcium. If any of those is interrupted, then you're going to have problems delivering that calcium to our newly developing tissue. So this is as much a water disorder in some cases as it is a nutrient disorder. So if you cut the flow of water, irrigation, you have improper irrigation, you have a drought period where the plant doesn't take up enough water, then you're not going to move calcium. Again, it's going to be in high demand and rapidly expanding tissue in places where you have meristems or new growth. So how do we deal with this? Well, of course, our liming program is going to be important. But we get calcium disorders in soils with plenty of calcium. We can up that calcium without raising the pH with the use of gypsum, and we do that in some crops like potatoes. Then we have our calcium fertilizers that can be added through irrigation system, like a drip system, or they can be sprayed on. The issue with calcium is it does not move very much from where you apply it as a foliar. So it'll get into the leaf, and it may take 2 days for it to get into the leaf, and then it's not going to go anywhere. Same with the fruits, developing fruits. So the one case where we have good luck with spraying on calcium is with apples. And so most apple growers are spraying additional calcium on, and it does cure those problems that we see, those spots in the apple. Other than that, it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work to control blossom end rot, for example. Boron's another one that's pretty unique to vegetable crops. It's involved in sugar metabolism, hormone development, auxins, and then flower, fruit, seed formation. So we see this in some crops as hollow stems or internal cork, cracking, splitting in external cork on plants. We'll see reduced fruit set, reduced seed set, and we'll see growing tip death. On the other hand, you can fry plants with boron. Just a little extra boron, you'll kill it. So it has a real narrow application window, application rate amounts that you can use. So the crops that we have issues with are crops that you see that are from drier areas of the country. So beets, carrots, radishes, the things that have roots that are developing. We'll see it on our coal crops. So boron is needed in higher amounts in many of our coal crops. Spinach is required in higher amounts. So it's a mobile element, so it's leached out of our soils in the east, so we need to add it to almost all of our vegetable crops. So it's depending on, you'll see this in your vegetable guide, half a pound to 3 pounds per acre, depending upon the crop, but it has a low safety margin. And in particular, with snap beans, you do not want to apply boron to snap beans as a banded, it'll kill plants. So our high boron crops are coal crops, mustard family crops, and our beet family crops. So that's spinach, beets. And then these are crops that require moderate amounts of boron. And then generally we're broadcasting this. With coal crops, we can put soluble boron and correct deficiencies also. All right, potassium disorders. Certainly this is an issue in field crops also, such as soybeans. But we have a lot of issues with potassium in our fruiting vegetables. In particular, it's an osmotic regulator and it's important in photosynthesis and respiration, but it's essential for fruit quality. Essential for maintaining sugar levels, and it's important for developing those fruit tissues. So generally in deficiencies, we get fruit disorders, we'll get irregular ripening, or we'll get low sugars with calcium issues. So, potassium issues. So we see it in a lot of crops as that edging on the older leaves. But we have these fruit disorders. With tomatoes in particular, you'll see the yellow shoulders, and then when you cut into the tomato, you'll see white tissue. Those are all an issue with potassium not getting into the fruit at adequate levels. There's reasons for that. Related to heat, related to root activity, not necessarily you don't have enough potassium, although with tomatoes, we always want to load them up with potassium. So for a lot of our crops, even though you have soil tests that come back high, if you're growing tomatoes, you're going to put it on black plastic mulch, you're going to have to add more potassium, even if it's already high. So tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant, and then melons, particularly cantaloupes, they require that potassium to develop the sweetness. Potatoes, carrots, sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes use a lot of potassium. They don't need much anything else, but they do need a lot of potassium. And then some are tree fruits, small fruits are going the same thing with sugars. And then broadcast applications are fine. In some crops, it's better to band because you'll get better efficiency. We put a lot of our in plastic culture through the drip so that we're getting that potassium through the season, particularly when the fruiting's going on. And it is effective foliarly. Now you can't put much on, but it will absorb, and it's one of those that will translocate from foliar applications. As with all crops, nitrogen can be an issue. You know why it's important: proteins, enzymes, chlorophyll, photosynthesis. So overall, chlorosis and the oldest leaves being yellow is the symptoms. With fruits and vegetables, though, too much nitrogen can give you problems. We get a lot of viney growth. So, for example, you'll get reduced fruiting, reduced storage organs. One way to guarantee that you get not many sweet potatoes is to over-fertilize with nitrogen. You'll get wonderful vines. Unless you're eating vines, it's not going to help you any. So your typical symptom here, I'm using the chlorophyll meter. This is some sweet corn. They had put manure on, so they thought they were going to get released from manure. It didn't happen. and this is what it looks like. That should be up above 50 on that chlorophyll meter. We have tools that we can do in the field with petiole sap testing for nitrogen and potassium. So there's recommendations throughout. In our book we have some, but you can get these off of, particularly go to University of Florida website, they have these recommendations. So that in season you can do without sending it off to a lab, you can do this right in the field. Recommended you do it in the morning, usually before midday in the morning, before noon in the morning. And so there's some sufficiency ranges for tomato. And they have, there's a new set out now. I don't remember which company, but one of the companies has much better testers now. I'll have to get you that information. Okay, magnesium, again, a very common issue with some of our vegetable crops. Again, it's important for development of chlorophyll, enzyme activity, gene activity. And it's that interveinal chlorosis on the lower leaves. It is mobile, so it's transferred out of lower leaves into new growth if there's a deficiency. It's also important for fruit quality. So along with potassium, magnesium is important for many of our fruits. We see magnesium deficiencies on cucumbers, other vine crops, but tomatoes probably the number one. Particularly we see it in high tunnels, we see it in greenhouse production, and we can see it in field production. We do get some cases with bean crops, oftentimes associated with low pH soils. So if you have a really low pH, that magnesium is not going to be available. You get down around 5.2, you're going to have magnesium deficiencies. I wouldn't advise you go down to 5.2 unless you're growing blueberries. Yeah, a little bit lower, 4.8. Again, the many sources, we generally rotate with dolomitic lime so that you keep your magnesium levels up. You don't want to overdo that because you want to make sure you have a balance with the calcium. Epsom salts, magnesium sulfates, very effective. It's very mobile. It can be sprayed on as a foliar application, and it moves in the plant very quickly. So it will correct the deficiency foliarly pretty quickly. Sulfur, a lot of good work being done. I know Jerry Bruce, my colleague, Maryland, he did some work recently with watermelons. I know Mark Ryder did work with sweet corn in East Shore, Virginia, but we're seeing sulfur deficiencies across all of our vegetable classes. And so this is something we're recommending most growers consider, particularly on our sandy soils, coastal plain soils. Maybe not so much on our heavier soils. Oops. And you know the reason we're not burning, we're not polluting so much through the air, so we're not getting free sulfur anymore. It's similar to nitrogen deficiency, and it's a general overall yellowing, or oftentimes a yellowing in the middle of the plant, or even in the upper part of the plant. So we're recommending 30 pounds per acre of sulfur for most vegetable crops. Sweet corn and sandy soils, very important. Tomatoes, peppers will have high nitrogen demand. Remember, why are nitrogen and sulfur related to each other? Think of your amino acids. All right, every amino acid has nitrogen in it. 4 amino acids has sulfur in it. So you're building proteins. Proteins make everything happen in the plant. So if you don't have enough sulfur, you're not going to be able to produce the proteins. We have a lot of ways to get potassium, potassium sulfate, ammonium sulfate, K-mag, liquid sulfur, gypsum. There are a lot of ways to get sulfur into a system. Oftentimes we'll use some ammonium sulfate because you're getting some nitrogen and sulfur. It's 21% nitrogen, 24% sulfur.
How much percent of sulfur you get in gypsum?
You would ask me that. So it's CaSO42. Quite a bit.
A lot.
Yeah, it's a significant source. So ammonium sulfate, it'd be very similar to ammonium sulfate, so probably in the low 20s.
23.5.
What?
Ammonium sulfate's about 23.
Right, how about gypsum?
I'm sorry?
How about gypsum? Yeah, all right. We'll look it up.
Same problem you got.
Yeah, there you go. All right, manganese. You have problems in field crops with soybeans and with small grains with manganese. We don't have that much problem in vegetable crops. Occasionally we'll see a field of sweet corn with manganese deficiency if the pH is high. Where we see a problem is actually with manganese toxicities. So in cantaloupes in particular is one where if the pH drops a little bit, we'll get the manganese toxicity. So this is what it looks like, these spots showing up on the leaf. You put them up to the sun, and then they'll develop into lesions. So we see this every year, and it's always a field where the pHs drop, it seems. Iron, zinc, and copper, not usually limiting for vegetables in our region because we don't have those high pHs that are going to cause these to be reduce availability. We've seen zinc occasionally in sweet corn, particularly where we have high phosphorus. We don't have any high phosphorus soils on the shore, I'm sure. That was a joke. And then in the greenhouse, we also have iron deficiency in transplants. I've grown pepper plants and they turn white in the greenhouse because of iron deficiency, because the pH got up because we have high carbonate water that we're irrigating with. All right, so those are some of the deficiencies. Any toxicities, any questions? I'm going real fast because I've got a lot of stuff here. Yeah.
How efficient is spreading dry granular boron or boron issues if you're broadcasting? Is that going to get throughout all the soil solution, or?
Yeah, it's pretty, generally it works for most crops unless you have a deficiency you're trying to correct. Let's say you have a cabbage crop and it's deficient. Then you're going to have to go in and do a foliar. Even though it's waxy leaves, the soluble is going to be needed there. But yeah, generally we don't recommend that you do anything banded. I know they do with corn, they like banding some boron, but generally we don't want to do that because of crop safety. We can put it through drip. Again, be careful with the rates. All right, our environment. We get situations with heavy rain and flooding. We have any years recently where we flooded any crops? Not this year, but last year I had my watermelon variety trial underwater for about 12 hours. Came back. And then dry soils. We usually don't have dry soils in vegetables. Why, James? There you go. In fact, we like dry years. We put the water on. Can't take the water off so easily. One that's killing us and going to continue to kill us is heat. Any idea why we're going to have continued problems with heat? The climate's changing. It's getting hotter. We're going to have, in my lifetime, it's going to change a couple degrees. That's going to affect a lot of crops, a lot of vegetable crops. Light. Radiation, we'll talk a little bit more of that. Cold, air pollution, soil environment. So let's look at some of those. I just showed, this was one year, I think it was 2011. This was one stretch where how many days above 90 did we have? Yeah, that's not good for vegetable crops. Even heat-loving vegetable crops like watermelon. All right, here's some of our cold temperature disorders. Anybody know what we call that? It's called cat facing. I don't know why. Cats don't look like that, but that's what they call it. So that's where, when during pollination for tomatoes and you get cold weather, this is what will happen. We can also get some fruits that don't develop properly. Here's another disorder that's cold weather related, which is stip in peppers. These little spots, particularly on red peppers in the fall. Of course, we have in fruit formation, I grow peaches, so 1 year out of 5, I'll lose a good part of the crop because we have a late freeze. Strawberries, we have to protect them because, again, they're going to be developing fruit during those periods where we have freezes. And that's why we use row covers. We monitor bud temperatures in strawberries, and we can use the use ice as a means to release heat. So we have an expert in the room. He can explain more about that.
And the secret's not the ice, it's the ice freezing. And
It's continuing to release heat. So
you gotta keep on water
yeah.
on it until it sloughs off.
Otherwise, you'll freeze them to death. Grapes, real susceptible to cold damage, particularly our vinifera types, our European wine grapes. And so we had, it dropped down to -8 back in 2012, I think it was.
It was cold enough, a lot of them going out, especially on the lower sides.
Yep. Wind damage, we get kind of a sandblasting effect on the eastern shore and the Delaware down on the sandy soil. So you can see this where it actually almost cuts off plants in windstorms. That's why we need cover, we need windbreaks. We'd like to do more plantings where we're using cover. So that's almost all of our watermelons, early watermelons are grown with windbreaks. So a lot of our vegetable growers are going, any early vegetables that will benefit from that because it cuts down on the wind. It also decreases cold damage. We can also use tunnels for that, row covers. All right, here's some of our hot temperature effects. So we have internal necrosis in potatoes. We can get the scorch and sunburn on fruits, and then this internal white tissue in tomatoes. So this disorder is a combination of potassium and high temperatures, particularly high root temperatures. So what would be two ways to reduce white tissue? Anybody open a tomato and it just looks crappy inside? How about this summer? A lot of tomatoes outside grown in the field look crappy because too much heat. How do you deal with this?
You no-till it, you no-till late tomatoes, and that cover will cool it down.
Right.
Cover rye will cool it down better.
Or you can switch to white mulch.
That's right.
Or you can make sure they have a variety that's less susceptible, and we have a few. I did a study this year, and I found a couple that are less susceptible. And you up the potassium, and you just keep on and put some foliar potassium on. Anybody see this? Transplants go out, and you get this. All right, that's where you get a necrosis, a heat necrosis at where you have black plastic mulch right around the mulch. What would a black plastic mulch in the middle of July, or say the end of June, be on a hot day, long hot day in the 90s?
110 plus.
140. Right. That's pretty hot. That'll kill anything that it's near. So peppers in particular, we have problems with them. In broccoli, what happens is high temperatures actually kill the newly developing florets when they're teeny tiny, and then when they come out, you get these brown florets. So, how do we manage this? Well, we can switch to white plastic. When do we switch to white plastic? You tell me, because I don't know. Generally, the rule of thumb, third week in June, switch to white for our sensitive crops. Should you go earlier? I did 1 year study where I went earlier. I put some watermelons on at the end of May, and they just sat there. Did nothing. I had reflective mulch. They almost died. So, there's a reason why I use the black mulch. All right, so we do get scorch, fruits, the sunburn and scorch. There's a couple different types. There's one that just kills the pigment. There's one that kills the tissue, and where you get hotter. So in about 110, you'll destroy the pigments. You get up to 115, you'll actually kill tissue. You get above 120, you're going to have major scorch issues on the fruit. The other issue is then when we lose foliage cover. And when that happens, when you have a heavy fruit load on, whether it be watermelons, peppers, you get this, what we call the phototype scorch, where it's too high a light intensity. So that's a common issue with peppers. What do we do to manage this in peppers? We stake the peppers so that they have good leaf cover. All right? Just don't grow them so that they flop over. And then you really shoot the nitrogen, try to get a lot of leaf cover on it. All right, there's apples, watermelons, strawberries. These are all crops that can get this fruit scald, fruit scorch, fruit sunburn. Watermelons, because they have dark rinds, this can be a big issue. What's a tool that we have to control that in watermelons? We spray on usually a particle film, so like a calcium carbonate white material to get rid of some of that. What's the issue with spraying on white stuff on fruits? Yeah, so you have to get rid of it somehow. So usually the calcium carbonate products, when they go through a brush, they come off. Some of the clay products stick on a little bit too much, so you have to wash them. We can see it in sweet corn, the scorch. Greening is a problem in our root crops when they're exposed to sun. That green tissue actually has higher levels of alkaloids. If you ate a whole bag of green potatoes, wouldn't help you any. It's going to make you sick because it's slightly toxic. Field tomatoes, when we get rain, particularly during the ripening period, particularly when it's been dry ahead of that, we get massive amounts of problems with cracking. How do you manage that?
Grow them in high tone.
There you go. True.
Keep them wet.
Make sure you have even moisture so that you don't have, but a lot of this is moisture that's going in through here. And so you can't control that. That you need varieties that don't crack, don't rain check. Same with melons. We get, if you get a broccoli that's not domed correctly, the water will set in there and it'll do the same thing. All right, on the other hand, everybody close your nose, put your hand over your mouth for 3 minutes. Well, anyway, you get the point. Low oxygen is going to cause problems in our root crops. So you'll see the internal tissues of potatoes dying. You'll also get this raised lenticels in potatoes. So these are all disorders where you have low compacted soils or low oxygen. So any of our root crops, we can get problems with, basically they need oxygen for metabolism to respire. A little water problem there. That's from, what was the hurricane that hit Jersey?
Oh, Sandy?
Sandy. So that's Sandy's effect right there. He's got a good attitude. All right, so we can get fruit cracking in peppers, particularly red peppers, where we have nighttime relative humidity near saturation, and then you get really sunny days. We see physiological leaf curl in tomatoes, which is the plant is trying to reduce the amount of transpiration going on, and it's really cosmetic more.
Some varieties more susceptible to it than others.
Yeah, a lot of home garden varieties are in particular. Irregular moisture, again, we talked about blossom end rot, but it's a major problem in potatoes, particularly our russet potatoes. We used to grow russet Burbank just for fun because you get the irregular moisture and they have all these little knobs in it. It's not adapted, well, like that. But again, we get problems with interior qualities. I put this one up because a lot of folks thought that this rapid change and growth caused hollow heart and watermelon. It doesn't. I'll talk about that more later. Water blister, that is where you have high humidity and you're not allowing that water to be able to transpire and your cells just explode. So we see that on pumpkins, we see that on peppers, we see it on cabbage leaves. And then air pollution, which is a major issue when we have those air inversions and with certain crops. Watermelons, we can see a lot, particularly on our pollinizers, in the icebox type. We see it in squash, we see it in potatoes, we see it in beans. So that's what it looks like. And basically it just looks like the leaf has turned white. Potatoes, that's what ozone damage looks like. Anything you can do about air pollution damage? They've tried some of the antioxidant type materials with some success, but generally you're trying to get varieties that aren't susceptible. All right, poor pollination causes abnormal fruit receive development, and so this could happen with cold weather. Why is cold an issue with poor pollination? Well, we'll talk about that. Heat, bee activity. This is a big one. Then lack of pollen and drying winds. I keep doing it. So this is what you'll get. You'll have deformed fruit. You'll get fruit that where the seeds haven't developed, and so the fruit underneath, the aggregate fruit, the strawberries where the fruit haven't developed properly. See it in the aggregate fruit again. Misshapen watermelons, particularly seeded types, and again, misshapen fruits. So these are all issues that are happening at pollination. In our bean crops, we have a massive problem with split set. So what will happen is the plant will start flowering, fruiting, and then get a hot period, it'll drop blooms, and then it won't start resetting fruit until the temperatures drop. If you're a processor, you know, here's one there, and then nothing until later down here. What do you do with a split set if you're a processor? You either have to take the early crop or take the late crop, because you're not going to get a full crop. We have day length issues and where we have plants bolting. If you plant your mustards, turnips, collards, kale too early in the spring, you get them in March, they'll likely bolt on you because you've exposed them to enough cold weather that they've met a cold requirement to go to flower. So if you just wait a month where they're not going to get that cold, you won't have that problem. Spinach is really susceptible to bolting. Lettuce, it's both day length and temperature, high temperature. So high temperatures will cause lettuce to bolt. All right, some other issues. Anybody seen this on peppers? Called silvering. This is where the skin splits from the tissue underneath. This is a variety disorder, somewhat related to Phytophthora-resistant varieties. They tend to have more problems with it. Poor quality seed. Just stop me, Ryan. I'll go on. Oh, good. Poor quality seed. This is a big issue in sweet corn, large seeded crops. This happens to be a lima bean field. Stand pretty good here. All right, this is just bad seed. All right, how can you make a good seed into a bad seed?
Heat.
What's that?
Heat.
Heat.
Cold.
Cold. Heat, not so much cold, but yeah, if you put that seed in a hot warehouse, hot, humid warehouse, it's going to lose viability very quickly. If you have people that are gorillas and they like flinging the big seeds, that'll drop your germination.
Sitting in the back of a pickup in the middle of the summer will kill a pig with germ.
Yep. Yeah, so seed needs to be stored in a proper environment so that's cool, dry area. We had, any of our research station folks here, James? All right. We had a box where we kept stuff we used to call the death box because you put the seed in it and you knew the germination was going to drop very drastically. They've corrected that. So one of the things that we like to see people do, particularly for sweet corn, if you have an issue, is request a cold germ test. And there's a couple different tests that you can request that show you whether or not that seed's going to germinate in cold soils. Again, most of our seed labs will do that for you. If not, I can give you information where you can find them. But you can see that you have wide variation. This was seed that we had in one of our processing sweet corn trials. In the cold germ test, you can see we had some that were way below where we needed them to be. Get that issue every year. By the way, I've visited a bunch of seed companies over the winter. How long are they going to keep seed? Let's say bean seed. So if this company out in Washington State, it's got a warehouse full of bean seed. They're going to rotate that every year, have new seed every year? Heck no. That's a dry, cool climate. They're just going to keep that until the germination is no longer any good. And they have tricks also to deal with make the germination better. I didn't know any of that until I visited these places. So if you think you're getting last year's seed production, you may not be. So that's why it's important to do some quality testing. All right, my favorite subject is heart and watermelon. Did probably 7 years worth of work on this, and everybody said, you know, it's too much nitrogen. Well, no, not necessarily. Nobody could ever repeat it. Or say it goes wet to dry to wet. Nobody could do it. We started looking at limiting pollen, and when we limited pollen on susceptible varieties, we always got it. So this is a pollination disorder. So if you don't have enough pollen being transferred from the pollen source on seedless watermelons, which is your pollinizers, to your seedless variety, you can get this issue. And we found that it's largely the less dense varieties. So we get a real dense variety like a Crunchy Red or 9651, one of those with a real dense, or crunchy types, they generally don't hollow heart. It's the ones with less dense flesh. And our vine crops, you'll go through a field, say mid-August or to late August, and you see this. And you're thinking, oh, my spray program's bad. No, it's just the leaves are getting old. So this is a problem with our really large leaf crops. Is that leaf, particularly you get a little storm damage in there, you get it whipped around, those leaves, particularly the inner crown leaves, they're going to just die or slowly die on you. And we just call it leaf aging. Anything else, Bob?
No, that's a good comment there. Now, you got some bacterial issues may come in and give you a symptom somewhat similar, but you usually can, you know what I mean, get that tested out.
Yep. Skinning. Skinning in potatoes, a really interesting subject, is potatoes have to go through a process where that skin sets. There's only one layer of cells underneath the epidermis that controls that. And if you get right environmental conditions where it gets wet again, after you've already killed the potatoes, oftentimes they'll start to skin again. So, so this is an issue we see from time to time where our potatoes, even though we've killed the vines and they should have set the skin, they start skinning again. We get this problem from time to time as hail. Luckily, we're not like out in the Dakotas where it's a yearly problem. But what do you do with an issue like this? Is that interior going to be affected? No. So you want to keep this healthy. And bacterial diseases are going to be the issue that you're trying to deal with. Anybody know what this is? I'll show you a better picture. That's a grafted tomato where the rootstock started regrowing. We had a whole field of watermelons that did this year where the rootstock started regrowing, which is a big, it's a bottle gourd, so it was just a useless field. So if you're getting grafted plants, you want to make sure that you're not having that problem with the rootstock regrowing on you. All right, so I wanted to end up with just a talk about foliar fertilization because there's a lot of misconceptions out there about it, and we have to correct some of these deficiencies with foliar fertilization. So, you know, the advantages of foliar is that we can use it to maintain or enhance our plant nutritional status. We'll often get quick effects. It can correct deficiencies, and we can use it multiple times, and we don't have the issues with tie-up in the soil. However, we have a problem with frying plants by having too high of salt levels, and you can only get a limited amount, just a couple pounds into the plant per acre at any time, and you have to do multiple applications, oftentimes very costly, and it's not always effective. So where I like using foliar fertilizer is to either prevent or correct the deficiency, particularly when the root system function is impaired. When do we get impairment in root systems in vegetable crops? All right, flooded conditions. That's where we might put some foliar on after a flooding event. Yeah, well, certainly if you have something that's really hurting the roots. In that case, yeah, you only get limited effect because you have so much damage.
They already got limited root growth.
Right. So we mentioned that we're in a plastic bed with tomatoes. That top area where you usually would have effective roots, those roots are dead or not effective because it's too hot. That's where a foliar may come in. And then if we're trying to improve color, I did work with pickles showing with some sulfur applied foliarly can improve color, improve quality. That's where we get with magnesium, potassium sometimes, and of course yield. So the case is, where does that nutrient get into the leaf? So you're applying it to the leaf. It doesn't go through the stomates. It goes through channels within the cuticle. And so as these negative charges can get through the channels, negative charges in the channels can allow positive ions to get through. So it favors neutral and positively charged nutrients. And so you can see here some of those channels that will allow. Now on fruit, it's hard to get foliar in because of that waxy layer, and it becomes very difficult to get enough nutrients in. So these are the ones that work. Nitrogen, potassium, and magnesium. They're effective foliarly. Locally, we can correct local deficiencies in the leaves with iron, manganese, zinc, and copper with foliar applications. But we have problems with these ones: calcium, phosphorus, boron, and sulfur, particularly calcium and phosphorus. Hard to get into the plant. And this is one of the reasons why. So if you apply foliar nitrogen, you're getting that in the leaf within 2-hour period. Phosphorus, say 5 to 10 days, has to be on that leaf. Potassium, within a day. Calcium takes up to 2 days to get into the leaf. Magnesium, just a few hours. Sulfur and zinc, manganese, well, sulfur is 8 days. No, yeah, 8 days. Zinc and manganese, 1 to 2 days. And then iron, molybdenum, it takes a long time to get them into the leaf.
Question for you.
Yeah.
You got calcium up there 1 to 2 days, and let's say you know you have a deficiency. What would happen if you used calcium nitrate to go through the soil?
Well, again, the soil applications, if there's a deficiency, it's hard to get enough in. But if you're doing like a drip system, using like a chelated calcium, you can have enough efficiency to get that into the plant sometimes. But getting the amount that you need is hard. And so, again, our nitrogen we can use in vegetables. Urea sources are the most effective. And then urealdehydes are very effective. Potassium is very effective. Remember, these are potassium sulfate has a lower salt index. So this would be the preferred. Potassium nitrate has a high salt index. Magnesium, Epsom salts are the most, usually the one that's used the most. And then we tend to try these chelated calcium products. Remember, getting into those channels, though, is hard. And then once it gets in the leaf, it doesn't move. It just kind of sits where it gets in. There are some cases where it does work. Like I said, it does work with apples. And then our chelates or sulfates of our metals are what we use to correct deficiencies there. Phosphorus doesn't go into the plant very well as a foliar. Boron can, and where it works a lot is with our cold crops, and we'll put soluble boron in those. Now, how many folks from fertilizer companies are here? All right. You have usually a bunch of mixes that you have for foliar, correct? Now, so the question is, do you need to mix? And it all depends. Probably the most common is nitrogen potassium. Why would that be a good combination, particularly for fruiting vegetables? Both get in the plant quickly. All right. Nitrogen calcium, not so much. The nitrogen go in depending what form it's in. But like calcium nitrate, it's not a really good foliar formulation. Remember, we like urea formulations for nitrogen. And then nitrogen and micros depends on what the issue is. So these combination products, you have to consider whether or not you're getting effectiveness of everything in the combination.